Hello and welcome to Let's Talk. And here we are in Westminster on a lovely sunny day. We've come to talk to Blair McDougall, who is a member of the ruling Labour Party and is the chair of the All-Parliamentary Group on Hong Kong. He has some quite strong views, not only on what's going on in Hong Kong, but also on what the current government, his government, is doing about it.
Which French Duke conquered England in 1066?
William the Conqueror.
A is Richard III, B is Henry VIII, C is Duke of Normandy, and D is Edward I.
Maybe the Duke of
Normandy. Duke of Normandy would be William the Conqueror,
Yes.
I think. Yeah. He was Norman.
So Duke of Normandy.
Although you're making me doubt myself now.
In which year did the Glorious Revolution take place? A. 1649, B. 1688, C. 1707, D. 1215.
A. 1640.
Oh, I would have said 1688. But...
1688 is the correct
Oh, is
answer.
that? Oh, amazing.
Terrible.
Where was William Shakespeare born? A. Cambridge, B. Oxford, C. Stratford-upon-Avon, D. Bath.
Stratford-upon-Avon.
Correct. What is Scotland's national sport? A. Football, B. Rugby, C. Shinty, D. Cricket.
Very much football.
I would say football as well. Is it not?
Well, the distinctively Scottish sport would be shinty, yeah. But most Scots, it's football.
The answer is Shinty.
Oh.
In which year did the Human Rights Act come into effect? A. 1948, B. 1998, C. 2005, D. 2010.
1998.
Yeah.
Correct.
And let me ask you specifically, which is mainly why we invited you at this particular time, about the Jimmy Lai Bill. First of all, what is its main purpose and why did you introduce it?
Well, the government already have a commitment to introduce a couple of things: a right to consular access for British citizens, and to introduce
Doesn't that exist already?
It doesn't at the moment. It's entirely discretionary, which is, I think, quite surprising to lots of people. And the second thing is a special envoy on those who are arbitrarily detained or in complex kind of hostage situations and things like that. So the government already has plans to do this. The point with the Jimmy Lai Bill was to particularly highlight the risk to journalists and to British journalists for being detained unfairly overseas. And frankly, also in the middle of Jimmy Lai's trial, to shine a light on it. It was just another moment to make sure that his name and his case was raised in Parliament.
I mean, the impression that a lot of people have is that the government has been less than vigorous in seeking consular access to Jimmy Lai, even though they say they've sent messages.
Yeah, I think there's one of the problems with these cases, which is why I think it's important to have the legal right and the special envoy, is that a government that is pulling out all the stops and doing everything it can behind the scenes looks almost identical to a government which isn't, because so much of this work goes on patiently behind the scenes. So it's sometimes difficult to tell. I say that as someone who, I would desperately love to see, British ministers knocking on the door of authorities in Hong Kong, personally demanding access.
Apparently we didn't see that when Catherine West visited last year.
Yeah, well, indeed, and I think we do need to be a little bit more vigorous. Having said that, I'm very much a kind of activist backbencher, so I don't have the challenge of sitting across from ministers and officials of the PRC and having to make these arguments. So I do acknowledge that they need to be careful and diplomatic, but I think the longer Jimmy Lai's case goes on, I think the more the outrage grows at the way he's been treated.
And he may well be, we don't really know this, but he may well be in very bad health at the moment.
Well, whether he's in great health, he's a man in his 70s who's been kept in solitary confinement for years. So I think even the most vigorous and spry septuagenarian would be suffering in those circumstances. But whether you're in good health or bad health, you should have justice. You should have consular access, and you should not be persecuted for exercising the rights that are guaranteed to you.
And that really brings us on to a much more general question, which is, there is general disappointment, I think, particularly in the Hong Konger community, but elsewhere, at Britain's lack of a vigorous attitude towards the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party. For example, what's happened to this reset of relations we keep hearing so much about?
The China audit.
Yes.
Yes. Well, we're told it's coming. I mean, what I would like to see from that audit is a little bit of honesty. There are so many areas where Beijing is very, very clear about what it will and will not allow in terms of its relationship with other countries. They're very strict with the sharing of data and all sorts of other things. I think what's disappointing is not being as clear about where our red lines are. Because if Beijing is saying here is our list of things that we won't compromise on, then it's difficult to see how they could take offence when we say there are things that we won't compromise on. And for me, I think the status of Hong Kongers and our historic responsibility there, primarily because it's the right thing to do, but also because it speaks to our credibility internationally in terms of whether we are a country which stands up for the agreements that we make and for people we have responsibilities to. That has to be a red line. And I would also say slave labour coming out of Xinjiang has to be a red line as well. And I just don't accept the idea that People's Republic of China will pull up the shutters and say we won't trade with you if you're clear about those things. They know how we feel about them, but at some point there has to be consequences to the arguments that we're making.
Well, the argument that the government puts is that Britain wants to engage with China, there's all sorts of economic benefits, but the reality is, for example, when Rachel Reeves went to, the Chancellor went to China last year, she came back and announced that £600 million worth of trade over 5 years had been secured. China didn't even mention that on their side, and 600 million over 5. It doesn't sound as though this great prize of Chinese largesse is coming Britain's way, or even vaguely.
Well, we shouldn't overstate the importance of China's economic potential for the UK. Nor should we ignore it. It's a sort of fact of life.
Tiny investor in Britain.
Well, it's certainly not worth giving up on our values for, and I think that's the important point. But again, I'd make the point is that I don't accept we do have to choose between standing up for our values and having trade. You know, lots of other countries have significant disagreements with Beijing and still manage to have a business relationship within the areas that they choose. I mean, goodness me, America's in the middle of a trade war at the moment with China, but is still able to have that commercial relationship. Also, I have to say, a part of me also thinks that we'd be respected a little bit more by Beijing as well, by being very clear and honest about where we won't compromise on our values and on our security.
Well, talking of security, let's start with another of the issues, which is the building of this massive Chinese
super embassy.
It seems as though there's local opposition.
Yep.
It seems as though the security services have said it poses a direct threat to the security of the state.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The Metropolitan Police have somehow been persuaded that it's no longer a problem. What's your take on this?
Well, I think this is a great example of an area where there has to be reciprocity in the relationship with Beijing. So if you have a situation where British Hong Kongers are having wanted posters delivered to their neighbours, where we're seeing case after case where there are accusations of espionage, or the infiltration of the royal family, even. At some point there has to be a consequence to that, whether that is designation within the National Security Act and the security tiers that are there, whether it is refusing planning permission for the embassy. At some point there has to be consequences for those actions. Otherwise things will escalate.
But the reality seems to be that China asks and China is given.
Well, we'll see. I don't think we should be granting access to that while Beijing is in breach of the agreements we've made with regards to the freedoms of people in Hong Kong. I don't think we should be making it while there's still such widespread evidence of enormous crimes against Uyghurs.
And just specifically on Hong Kong related issues, what is your view on whether there's any justification for the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office to have any kind of status, quasi-diplomatic or whatever, in Britain, or indeed whether it should be allowed to function?
Well, I think it's one of the bargaining chips we certainly have. And this also goes back to your question about at what point do you start to damage wider relations with Beijing? There are several levels you can go through here. I think starting with the Hong Kong Trade and Economic Office, I think is a good starting point. You don't need to start immediately expelling diplomats from the Chinese embassy. You can start there. I think a good start would be making sure that when diplomats come to the UK, either through the Chinese government or the Hong Kong government, that there is proper screening of those individuals to make a judgment as to whether they have been involved in espionage or repression in the past, or whether they are likely to be in the future. But there are so many British people who are subject here and in Hong Kong to pretty appalling acts of oppression, and there has to be consequences to that. And I think the status of that office is a good place to start.
The other issue, and I know you've raised this in Parliament, has been relating to the British banks.
Yes.
Who are party, in fact, very active party, to the freezing of the MPF funds for Hongkongers.
I think this is an absolute outrage. And I think we need to say over and over again that this is happening to British people. Because I think there's sometimes a sort of lazy assumption that because this is happening to Hong Kongers, that it's a foreign policy issue, rather than an issue about the life savings of people who are British. Yeah. And I think the starting point for this has to be that feeling of absolute outrage at what has happened. And I think that's important because similar to the tearing up of the Joint Declaration and everything within it, here you have the question of whether commercial relationships are covered by the rule of law within Hong Kong. The other question I think here is, and this is something we, through the All-Party Group on Hong Kong, we requested that the banks come and explain to us their rationale.
This incidentally is the group you chair.
It's a group I chair, and they refused to come. And my sense is they refused to come is that I don't think they can easily explain the legal basis for what they're doing here. It seems that this is something that's been done by fiat rather than through clear legislation. I also think there's a worry, so I've started to pick up on Hong Kongers who've come here on the BNO scheme, who are beginning now to get indefinite leave to remain and full citizenship, who have gone back to the banks on the savings issue, and they're not being told no, but they're not being given an answer. And I think there was a little bit of an assumption with the Provident Fund issue that it would go away eventually when people's status changed. I'm not clear that that's the case at all. I think this is not an issue that's going to go away.
I mean, these are, I'm talking about the two big banks, HSBC and Standard Chartered, are registered by
banks.
the UK regulator.
Yep. Yep.
They are withholding people's money. They're withholding money that is freely accessible to other Hong Kongers who've emigrated, say, to Canada or Australia.
Yeah.
Why is the regulator silent on these matters?
It's a very good question, and it's one I'm asking in Parliament. More and more members of Parliament are discovering that there are large Hong Kong populations within their constituencies. I know it's difficult often for Hong Kongers to feel safe enough to be politically active when Beijing's hand can reach over here. But I think the more that happens, I think the louder the voice becomes in Parliament on behalf of Hong Kongers.
It's extremely interesting you say that, because the Hong Kong community, to be frank, is relatively small in Britain, although it in some places, you know, like Sutton.
But it's clustered together.
It's clustered,
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
So maybe, and I know Hong Kongers are very enthusiastic voters.
Yes, yes.
Having not been able to do that in Hong Kong. So.
Well, I found in the election, I would knock on a door, and it was a Hong Kong family that would answer. There was an element of surprise because it was a novelty to be experiencing this. But as you say, a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of questions about how it all works. So yeah, and I'm really pleased to have a couple of Hong Kongers working in my office now as well, which is wonderful.
Well, Blair McDougall, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
Which famous Scottish poet wrote the poem Auld Lang Syne, traditionally sung on New Year's Eve?
Rabbie Burns. Yeah.
Correct, without giving any hint. Where is Ben Nevis located? A. Wales, B. Scottish Highlands, C. Lake District, D. Northern Ireland.
It's in the Scottish Highlands, and I have climbed it several times.
Goodness.
In which region is the Giant's Causeway located? A. East of England, B. West of Scotland, C. Northern Ireland, D. West of Wales.
Northern Ireland.
I have no idea.
Steve!
I know nothing. I know nothing.
The novel, Locke Rise to Candleford, depicts life in which English county? A. Cornwall, B. Oxfordshire, C. Scottish Highlands, D. Yorkshire.
I'm going to say Oxfordshire.
I'm going to say I don't know.
Oxfordshire is
good.
correct. The last question. Which British scientist discovered electromagnetic induction? Correct.
Yeah,
Michael
well done.
Faraday. Without giving any hints to you. Congratulations. I'm not sure if you can pass.
Too many Scottish questions.
Yeah. It's one of the great ironies of racism is that immigrants always know more about these things than people who've been here our whole lives, because you have to study so hard for these tests. So, yeah.